Okay, so I think I've come up with the most JJ topic ever for a video. We are going to look at 5 video games that feature real-world politicians. The first one is Spitting Image the Game, which came out for various systems in 1988. The original Spitting Image was this British comedy show from the 1980s that featured these grotesque rubber puppets of world leaders and other politicians. And it was super popular, so of course they made a game of it. It's actually a historically interesting game because it's one of the first fighting games ever made. You got to play as one of 6 world leaders and beat up the other 5. The characters were Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Ronald Reagan, who was President of the United States, John Paul II, who was the Pope of the time, Mikhail Gorbachev, who was President of the Soviet Union, the Ayatollah Khomeini, who was dictator of Iran, and P.W. Botha, who is long forgotten now, but he was one of the last white presidents of South Africa during the apartheid times, and during the 1980s he was often considered one of the most wicked men in the world. Anyway, it was a pretty fun game, even if it was a little bit simple. It would be a few more years before someone else would come out with a more sophisticated game involving gross national caricatures beating up one another. Number 2 is Bad Dudes v Dragon Ninja. No, it is not the coolest lawsuit of all time, but an arcade game released by the Japanese studio Data East in 1988. The plot of the game is that President Ronnie has been kidnapped by ninjas, and it is your job to rescue him, which you do mostly by kicking a lot of people. Then at the end, the ninja helicopter comes down, and oh look, it's President Ronnie! Hey dudes, thanks for rescuing me. Let's go for a burger. Ha ha ha. And they did! They made an NES version of this game in 1990, but of course by then President Ronnie was long out of office, so they changed the president to look more like George H.W. Bush. But he didn't get a cool nickname, he was just the president. So if you had to pick an exciting chapter of American history to base a video game around, what would it be? Well, you're wrong, because according to the good people at Hex Software, the correct answer is the 1988 presidential primary. Yes, they actually made a very sophisticated Famicom simulation game based around one of the least compelling elections in modern American history. Basically, you pick from one of the dynamic and interesting presidential candidates of that year, including George Bush, Michael Dukakis, Pat Robertson, and Jesse Jackson, and decide what positions you want to take on the various hot-button issues of the late 1980s, like whether or not you should honor the terms of the Panama Canal treaties, or if you should quarantine all of the AIDS people. Now, I live in Canada, and you might think that Canadian politics is too boring to be game-worthy, and you would have been right, at least until 2010, when our biggest city elected a certain roly-poly crackhead as mayor. Last year, a Canadian artist named Stephanie Cascanet released a mod for Civilization V that allows you to play as Rob Ford as you seek to expand the borders of the mighty Toronto Empire. I don't know much about how Civilization works, but apparently Steph filled the game with all sorts of weird Rob Ford-related gimmicks and in-jokes. For instance, roads cost more to repair, and the Great Prophet has been replaced with Doug Ford. So there's a bit of edgy Canadian municipal political humor for you. So we've done Britain, America, Canada, and now for number 5, Japan. One of the most famous post-war prime ministers of Japan was a guy named Kokua Tanaka, who was in charge from 1972 to 1974. He ran an engineering firm during the war and had gotten rich from a lot of military contracts, and in his subsequent political career, he was known for being a little dodgy about mixing private and public business. After he left office, he was actually sentenced to prison for taking bribes. Anyway, in 1985, when the Prime Minister was still embroiled in legal trouble, Sega made a game about him called I'm Sorry. Basically, you play as the Prime Minister and go around various Pac-Man-esque mazes collecting gold bars and dodging Secret Service guys. For a country that isn't exactly known for hard-hitting satire of the powerful, this was pretty cheeky stuff. Amazingly, this game was actually released in America. They didn't even change it in any way. It was just, here America, have some game about some Japanese politician you've never heard of. Personally, since the game was made by Sega, I'm hoping that we'll see an appearance by Prime Minister Tanaka in the next Sonic Sega All-Star Team Racing whatever. Anyway, so that's 5 games featuring real-life politicians. Hopefully you learned a thing or two. Talking of video games, last week I also made a special guest video for my friend Eric's Pokemon channel, which you can check out here. And just a reminder that if you've been enjoying my videos over the last couple of months, maybe you could subscribe and like and all of the rest of that stuff. See you next week.